My name is Fran Varga, and I am a prevention coordinator here at Prevention Action Alliance. On behalf of our entire team, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for Coalitions Rising 2024. If you don't know us, Prevention Action Alliance is a nonprofit based in Columbus, Ohio, working to prevent substance misuse and promote mental health wellness. We provide all Ohioans with opportunities for prevention education, resources, and advocacy with the goal of empowering communities. We're excited to bring together such a great group of prevention professionals and community leaders for this event. Coalitions Rising is an event designed to empower coalitions and community-based organizations with the strategies they need to drive community change. Today, we're exploring best practices for strengthening partnerships across sectors, enhancing community resilience, and addressing the complex needs of special populations. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who made today's event possible. So thank you to all of the sponsors of today's Coalitions Rising conference, including our innovator sponsors, Origo Branding and Paxis Institute. Their generosity allows us to continue to bring national subject matter experts to speak on the topics most important to coalitions at no cost to our attendees. We are very grateful for their support. Before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items to address. If you experience any technical difficulties throughout the session today, please send a message in the chat to Ashley Donaldson. She is our event coordinator, and she will do her best to assist you. Attendees are encouraged to use the chat feature for any questions during the session. We'll also have some time for questions at the end. Unless you are called on by the presenter or the presenter gives specific instructions to unmute and engage, we ask that microphones remain off to prevent background noise that can distract from the session. Each of these sessions will be recorded and made available to attendees after the session. Availability of slides are at the discretion of each speaker. This session offers social work, CHES, and prevention continuing education credits. To receive your continuing education credits, you must complete the evaluation that will be provided at the end of each session. Contact hours presented on your certificate will directly reflect your time spent in the session. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Stephanie Strutner. Stephanie owns and operates an independent consulting firm, Catalyst Evaluation Group. She also serves as master trainer for CADCA and serves as the part-time CEO for the Prevention Alliance of Tennessee. Today, she will be presenting the session, utilizing environmental scans to create environmental change, where she'll dive into best practices for using environmental scans to develop community-driven solutions. That's my spiel. I'll hand it over to Stephanie to kick things off. Thank you so much for being here. We hope you enjoy the session.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, and it's great to be with you today. We're going to, of course, talk about environmental scans, and the first thing I want to do, I asked for a regular meeting format for this session because I wanted to have the opportunity to interact a little bit and create a little bit of dialogue. So first thing I'd like to do is just gauge from either your nonverbals. I'm looking at you in a gallery, and that's why I'm not sharing my slides yet, because I want to see you in the gallery. And you can either use your emoticons, you can use your reactions at the bottom of your Zoom chat bar, or feel free to turn to the chat because I'm really interested to know. First question is one, have you ever engaged in any type of environmental scan before in your line of work? So a simple yes or no, or a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Looks like there's a decent amount of experience out there. See some thumbs down, a bunch of no's in the chat, but many of you, it looks like you have had experience with environmental scans. So for those of you who have had experience with environmental scans, I'd like for you to turn to the chat box and let us know if your environmental scan was fruitful or not. And what I mean by being fruitful is, did you get data from that experience that you could do something with? And if so, what was the benefit that you experienced? See some answers starting to pop into the chat. And very much like I expected, oftentimes when we implement environmental scans, One of the things that we're doing is trying to fill in some of the data gaps that we're currently experiencing. Data gaps in our quantitative data. Usually environmental scans are something that we can do really quickly at a low cost and can do pretty easily, can spread it across either a couple people or a large coalition of people. And so based on your responses in the chat, looks like getting lots of data to help you make decisions as you're moving forward, investigating about your population of focus, identifying gaps and creating strategies, working with local businesses, serving as a great jumping off point, enabling to focus resources. You can continue reading through the chat, but I'm seeing lots of really good ideas and lived experience there. So please continue to share your experience in the chat as we move forward. I also want to make this session as interactive as possible. So if you have questions or if you have comments, please turn to the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll be happy to engage you in our conversation here today. Again, thinking about our environmental scans and how we specifically use that information that we gain from those environmental scans to help move population level change in our community is where we're really looking to go today. So we're going to talk about those environmental scans. We're going to talk about how we use them for identifying community issues and how we use them to inform policy and environmental change. A lot of times when we engage in an environmental scan, it's directly tied to some sort of policy change. And so we can use that as our launch point to really create that grassroots advocacy effort in our community to lead to that population level change. We're also going to explore some techniques about how we can engage our community members to be successful in planning and implementing our environmental scans. And then finally, we'll wrap things up today talking about how we can utilize data from our environmental scans to help shape our advocacy efforts and build support for that change in our community. So let's jump right in. We're going to talk about environmental scans, and let's start by defining them. So for those of you who said no, you had not been engaged in an environmental scan before, this might give us a helpful insight to frame our conversation for today. So sometimes when I'm out in the community and I talk about an environmental scan, and even when we're talking about coalition work and we talk about environmental strategies, some people's brains automatically go to the environment. And so in this case, when we talk about environmental scans, we are talking more so about the actual environment in which we live, more so than we're talking about when we talk about environmental strategies. When we talk about environmental strategies, we're really talking about those population level strategies that reach everybody in our population of focus. When we're talking about environmental scans, we're really talking about visual analysis of the environment in which we live and work and play in many instances. And so we're talking about that process that involves analyzing those external factors. Sometimes they can be internal as well, that could impact our organization's ability to implement strategies in the community and to engage in strategic planning. Just as you all identified in the chat box, thinking about using the information that we collect from our environmental scans to really set the stage for our ability to do work in the community, but also to engage in that strategic planning. One thing that's always been really important to me throughout my career is making data-driven decisions. And the environmental scan really gives us the ability to have that baseline of data so that we can make those data-driven decisions. We can push change in the direction where we know that our work is being effective rather than being busy. When we think about environmental scans, we also are using them because it's a great way to help identify trends and other forces that are having influence on the way that we operate in a community. It can help us to identify opportunities that exist and threats that exist in our communities. A lot of times organizations will engage in a SWOT analysis. You might have heard of a SWOT before. It's really scanning strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that are both internal and external to your organization. And so the environmental scan is a great way to really be able to assess those strategically. It also gives us a tool for identifying community level factors that impact issues like our health, our safety, substance use in a community, because it allows us to identify what other people see, not just from our perspective, but from the perspective of other coalition members or other volunteers or youth in our community. And then environmental scans finally also support that data-driven decision making for environmental change because it lays that foundation both in qualitative data and in quantitative data in our communities. Of course, quantitative data being those data that are numbers oriented or statistics oriented, and then the qualitative data that are more anecdotal, that tell us a little bit more about the depth of our issues. There are several components of an environmental scan. The first is the observation of our physical environment. And so an observation of our physical environment might be giving a tool to some volunteers who go out into the community and they just use their vision and they walk around a certain area or they drive through a certain region and they just make visual observations of what they see. And then we have some sort of list where they'll go through and they'll document what they see on that list. Policy audits can also be a part of environmental scan. The policy audit can be helpful, especially to lay the groundwork for a type of policy change in our community, because we never want to just pass policy to pass policy. We want to pass policy because it's an effective way to change behavior that's going to tie directly back to a local condition or a contributing factor on our logic model that's going to change the root cause, that's going to change our problem. And so when it comes to our policy, in order for us to be effective at passing policy and that leads to population level change, we have to know what policy exists. And in order for us to do that, it's best for us to go ahead and audit the policies that exist. When we're, especially at the state level, when we're thinking about policy change, it's really critical to audit that policy because there might be instances, in fact, this is coming up in my state right now, we're focused on increasing or adding a tax to e-cigarette products in our state. They're currently not taxed. And so one thing that we have to think about is if we were to propose a bill, for example, at the state legislature, then that's definitely going to catch the eye of the vape and nicotine and tobacco lobbyist. So in order for us to be most effective, when we did our policy audit, what we found is there are some policies that are very similar to what we want to do. And by creating a caption bill, we can stay under the radar and we can probably get that policy passed a little bit easier with making fewer changes to existing state laws. And it's going to give us the opportunity to do less work, but have a higher degree of effectiveness. And so by doing that policy audit, it positions us at a place to be more efficient in our work so that we can lead to effectiveness. Another type of environmental scan is getting community feedback. And so those perceptions, those qualitative data can be really important in shaping the way that we do our work, that we implement our work as coalitions. Obviously, a lot of what we do is based on people's perceptions, based on people's lived experience and their individual behaviors. And so by soliciting their qualitative feedback, it gives us the opportunity to position our strategies to best reach our population of focus. So I'll be honest with you, as a quantitative researcher, it was difficult for me when I first started in my career to really embrace qualitative data. But of course, obviously, you're not going to get very far in this field without embracing qualitative data. So once I did, I realized how important that qualitative data can be in our work. I think the important part about embracing qualitative data is identifying a mechanism by which you can quantify it. Because in order for it to be helpful for us moving forward to make those data-driven decisions and to measure our change from short-term to intermediate to long-term, we have to be able to compare, even if it's qualitative in nature, we have to be able to compare what we're collecting now to what the nature of the environment was a year ago and 2 years ago and 3 and so on. And so as you're thinking about those environmental scans and even collecting those qualitative elements, I encourage you to think about how you will quantify those elements so that you can use them, for example, on your logic model, or you can tie them to your work and your short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. I mentioned the types of environmental scan data already, but just to reiterate for some of you who might be new to gathering data, our quantitative data are those numbers-driven statistical data. They're measurable. The way that I differentiate quantitative versus qualitative data is quantitative equals quantity equals numbers. Those are our student survey results. Those are school discipline records. Those are a number of hospitalizations or treatment admissions. And so those quantitative data tell us very important numbers and statistics that talk about the depth of our data. Our qualitative data talk about people's perceptions, their lived experiences, the feedback of the community. We're going to get our qualitative data measures through environmental scanning, maybe through focus groups or one-on-one conversations with key stakeholders. Maybe it's a local store clerk or a business owner. And those qualitative data, we then pull back. They help us understand the breadth of the problems that we're facing, or those root causes or those local conditions. We incorporate both of these types of data into our experience and in our work in substance use prevention by being able to pull them together so that we can articulate multiple points of data that are helping to tell the same story. This is one of the levels of importance of environmental scans, because we can pair environmental scans with some of those historical or archival data elements that we get from our community, like student surveys or like hospitalization or other social drivers of health data. So we can use those collaboratively to help us pull our summaries, our epidemiological analyses together so that we can begin to shape and frame and tell our stories about what's going on in our communities and among our populations. So I want to give you a couple of examples of real life environmental scans. Excuse me. So in an environmental scan, the problem here, and this is a real example of, from my personal experience, an environmental scan that my coalition worked on. And the problem, think about our logic model. So think about this one line of logic. Our problem was nicotine use. Our root cause was favorable parent attitudes. And the local condition was parents were smoking at parks where their children were engaged in recreational activities like baseball and soccer. So parents are smoking at baseball fields and soccer fields, and also at playgrounds. So our data that we were able to collect was our youth coalition went and collected cigarette butts and used cigarette filters on and around the youth ballparks and playing fields. And they kept them in large plastic bins, and they took them to the city council. They had, by the way, previously approached city council to say, we would like our local parks to be smoke-free. And the city council kind of just brushed them off, didn't pay attention to them. And so this was actually the idea of the youth coalition. So they went and wore rubber gloves and picked up all of the trash related to cigarettes that had been discarded just on the ground. And they had 7 large tote bins that they carried in to the city council meeting during the public speaks portion. And when they presented that evidence to the city council finally said, okay, we're listening. Because not only could they see the impact of just from a couple parks of one time what the youth picked up, they could also smell it, and they saw how committed the youth were to engaging in this activity. And so the outcome was the city council ended up passing a policy that banned smoking at public parks. And yeah, Jennifer, I mean, youth leadership really is power, because our adults had tried to pass this policy once before, and they didn't get any traction. The youth went in and didn't get any traction. But when the youth went and engaged in an environmental scan and brought their data in, which was anecdotally measured in pounds, they brought the number of pounds of cigarette butts that they had collected into a meeting, and it was undeniable the problem that the community was facing. And so as a result of banning smoking at public parks, we went from having tons of cigarette butts laying around littering the ground to having virtually none, because the youth had picked them up. Now smoking was banned, and so it just wasn't there anymore. Another example, real life example, is related to underage drinking, and our root cause was price and promotion. So one of the issues that we faced in my community was we had a tremendous amount of both indoor and outdoor alcohol marketing in our communities, mostly at convenience stores. And so we knew from the Center for Alcohol Marketing and Youth that on average, adolescents every month are exposed to, I believe it's 24 branded alcohol-related messages. For every additional marketing message they're exposed to in the course of a month, increases their likelihood of underage drinking by 1%. And so that really resonated with our coalition. And our coalition wanted to, everybody kept saying, well, there's a lot. There's a lot. Well, a lot can be a qualitative measure, but we needed to be able to quantify it in some way, because we can't just go to city council and say, hey, city council, there's a lot of alcohol marketing signs at our stores. Because what are they going to do? Pass a policy that says, hey, stores, change your marketing from a lot to a little. There has to be some number associated with that. And so our coalition decided that we're going to go out and do an environmental scan of retail outlets. And in our community of population 75,000, we had about 136 retail outlets. So that was kind of a lot to go visit, but we broke it up over the whole membership of our coalition, and everybody took a few stores that was kind of on their daily commute. We ended up hitting all of the stores in the community and did a scan both inside and outside to identify how many alcohol related advertisements were in the store, how many were branded, how many were unbranded, and then we also measured the ratio of alcohol ads to counter alcohol ads. So a counter alcohol advertisement would be an age verification sticker, or a sign that talks about the dangers of underage drinking, or any health related message associated with alcohol use. And from that information that was collected, it was determined that there was already an existing ordinance of the number of alcohol related images that could be seen from the street, but none of the businesses in the community were in compliance with that ordinance. And so what it allowed us to do was twofold: limit the marketing, and what we did was limit the marketing ratio between alcohol advertisements and counter alcohol advertisements inside a store, and then have the policy that was already in effect have it be enforced. So the stores were limited to 2 exterior alcohol related marketing signs, and then there was not a limit on the number, but we limited the ratio of how much alcohol related messaging you could have versus counter alcohol messaging. And so Tabitha asks in the chat box, what was the time frame of both of these environmental scans? So if we go back to the youth collecting cigarette butts, that actually happened over the course of a week. So the Youth Coalition just visited, and they went together after school. They visited one park on one day, they went to another park on another day. So just 5 days of picking up cigarette butts. I think they probably worked for like an hour and a half each day. So that was over the course of the week. And for example number 2, for underage drinking, the environmental scan of the retail outlets, that took more like a month and a half. So what we did was, at our regular coalition meeting, we planned the tool that we were going to use. So we had a whole worksheet that every coalition member was going to use, one worksheet. And also, let me say, this was back in like 2012. So today we would definitely do a Google form or a SurveyMonkey or something that was electronic, so that we didn't have to hand compile all of that data. But in 2012, this is what we did. It was on paper. And if that's what you needed to do now, that would work as well. But on paper, we created these worksheets and had the name of the store, the address of the store, the time of day that it was visited, how many advertisements could be seen from the road, how many existed on the outside of the store, how many existed on the inside of the store, how many counter alcohol messages there were, and any notes that they needed to write. We also tracked which coalition member completed the scan. And so we just had a database of all of the stores in our community. So we created, we kind of separated the list. We let our coalition members sign up for which business they were going to go visit, and then they turned in those sheets either as they were passing by our office or at the next coalition meeting. So that took a little bit longer, and it ended up taking us about a month and a half to get all of those stores visited. And then I see Kathy asks, do you do server trainings as well? And so that server trainings were definitely part of our comprehensive approach to address underage drinking. It was for a different root cause though. One of our other root causes for the problem of underage drinking was retail sales. And so as a result of having a problem with retail sales, retail access, is we had store clerks. We had 2 different local conditions. We had store clerks who were selling alcohol without asking for ID. We also had store clerks who were asking for ID, but miscalculating age verification and selling anyway. And so we had to approach those two local conditions differently, which is an important factor in understanding your community. That can also be part of an environmental scan. So thinking about underage drinking alcohol compliance checks. Kathy, thanks for bringing this up because this is a good example of another way you can do an environmental scan. So conducting alcohol compliance checks that the police departments do is one thing, but them also documenting evidence from their environmental scan goes a step above and beyond what's required by law that gives us incredible data that we can use related to our strategies, and I'll tell you why. Understanding the difference of why a clerk is selling is really critical to how our strategies play out in real life. On one hand, if you have a store clerk who is maybe backed up or they're busy or for some reason they just forget to ask for ID, selling a product to a minor is one thing. If we have a clerk who is asking for an ID and they're looking at the ID, but they're selling even after looking at an ID, the strategies are going to play out differently. So for store clerks who asked for age verification but sold anyway, when we went after the environmental scan that our police officers did and then did a verbal environmental scan with them and said, hey, why did you sell? We got several different responses. One, most commonly, it was miscalculating the date of birth or miscalculating the age based on the date of birth. And so we were able to create a lot of point of sale materials, and we had age verification coders, ID coders for the stores that couldn't afford point of sale software. And, thinking about almost, 15, pushing 20 years ago now, point of sale software in our community wasn't the norm. And so we were able to put those point of sale materials out there. In addition to thinking about the store clerks who just weren't asking, the responsible alcohol sales training was really important for them to understand both the criminal and the civil penalties that they could experience as a result of those sales. And so all of these examples are part of that overarching strategy to comprehensively thinking about the 7 strategies for population level change: providing information, building skills, providing support, changing access and barriers, changing consequences, modifying the physical design of the environment, modifying policy, all fit together just from the environmental scan data to help us really create some strong strategies to tie back to that local condition, to affect the root cause, to affect the problem. Keep that dialogue in the chat box coming. Thank you all so much. So when we think about the environmental scan, and Larry, I see your question, were they really calculating or just glancing? And I think there was a combination of both, but in our community, they truly were miscalculating, because when we provided the age verification coders, when we did the responsible alcohol sales training classes, we went from 64% retailer compliance to 100% retailer compliance. This started in this was 2011 when it started. In 1 year, we went from 64% compliance to 100% compliance, and the community still maintains an over 95% compliance rate. There were some other strategies that came along with that, including how the local police and the sheriff's office did compliance checks. They used to just do them all in one fell swoop, and then they started spacing them out over several different days, so the stores didn't start a phone tree and say, hey, the police are doing compliance checks. So that also helped. So compliance remains high.
Stephanie, there's another question in the chat
about
the if there was an adult with youth when they did their scans, or if they did it in their own time.
Great question, Debbie. I see that now. Thank you, Fran. So I'm in Tennessee. So in Tennessee, it is required by Tennessee state law for law enforcement to be involved. And there are also a lot of stipulations, which I imagine your state has as well, with how those checks have to go. And so when we're thinking about compliance checks, is different from when the youth were collecting cigarette butts, for example. When our youth were collecting cigarette butts, there was an adult with them. The youth did it on their own time, but they did it after school, and our youth coordinator was with them. When we talk about the alcohol scans, we have to be very strict by Tennessee statutes as to how those happen. And so what we did, our law enforcement commonly had difficult time getting minor informants to participate in these compliance checks. And so they did them infrequently. So the coalition said, hey, we can help with that. We helped identify the minor informants. They had to be 19 or 20 years old. They could not be within 6 months of their 21st birthday. We really tried to use 19-year-olds. They had to be wearing age-appropriate clothing. They could not have facial hair. And we also took a photograph of both the minor informant and what they were wearing and their ID, because our beer boards were saying, hey, you're just trying to trick our people. And so the coalition, when we partnered with the police to do these compliance checks, we ended up buying some undercover surveillance gear as well, so that, excuse me, so that the beer boards could see the evidence of what happened. They could see the government issued ID pass across the counter. They could see either it happened or it didn't. They could see if the clerk actually did look at it, or if they just glanced at it, or if they scanned it with point of sale software. And then it just helped our beer boards to be able to hear what was happening, to be able to see what was happening. And then once they saw that there was no trickery going on, that they actually instituted higher fines, and we were able to institute a matrix of fines based on number of violations, that also helped with that. And so a little bit, and so the minor informants that worked for the police department got paid. The youth who were collecting cigarette butts did it on their own time as a volunteer opportunity. Our coalition members who did the alcohol retail outlet environmental scans did it as volunteer time, which was a great in-kind contribution that we could count because we had a drug-free communities grant at that time. And so we were able to count their time to be able to measure our in-kind to match our drug-free communities grant. And that was a huge project. It took actually a really decent amount of time, which I didn't mention. We had on for every volunteer when they went out to do the compliance or the environmental scans, we had another form that they would turn in, and they wrote down their name, the number of miles they drove, and the number of time it took them to go do those scans. And we racked up a ton of in-kind contributions as a result of that project to match our grant. So thanks for that question, Debbie. I hope I covered all of that as well. So environmental scans, I think we've talked about some of the examples, and there is some evident benefit, but a few other details about the benefit of environmental scans is it's just a really great way to fill in data gaps on our logic models. There are a few times where we can have an entire line of logic that's going to come from our student survey. And so anytime we can come up with ways that we have qualitative data that really tie specifically to our local condition, it's a great way to capture really strong data that we can measure again and again and again. It's also a positive way to engage youth and volunteers, as evidenced by the stories that I've told you from my experience. It not only does it give people something tangible to do, but also when it turns into a policy change, they really feel like they did something that was positive for the community, especially our youth. When they were able to go into city council after having been there once to talk to them and say, hey, this is a problem, city council blew them off. When they came back with evidence and city council said, okay, now we're listening, to see the youth, and it's almost like a peacock. You could just see them peacocking around, their feathers popped up, and it was just a really beautiful thing. So it's a great way to engage, especially our youth, but also adult volunteers, and really start that grassroots effort in our community for advocacy. And if we do it right, it's also a great way to build relationships, because when we're going into these stores during the compliance checks, if there is a pass or a failure, it gives us an opportunity for dialogue. And so giving resources is a powerful way to build relationships, especially when we're not asking for money. So if we have a grant that's funding point of sale materials, we can develop a relationship with the stores that give us the opportunity to give them something to help their employees stay in compliance. Or it helped us, when we talk about nicotine, it helped us build relationships with our Parks and Recreation Department, because when the law was passed, now all of a sudden there has to be a sign that notes that the parks are smoke free. Well, hey, guess what? We have grant funds. We can pay for those. So we were able to provide all of the signage to our Parks and Recreation departments so they didn't have to pay for them. We had volunteers who could go and help install the signs, and it gave people something to do to follow through from this strategy from start to finish. And so being able to build relationships across many different sectors of our communities through these different examples of environmental scans was a real benefit to us, not only increasing the concept of substance use prevention in our community, but also being able to build coalition capacity, increase our membership, increase business contributions, because we're giving to businesses. All of a sudden we have businesses who are willing to give back to our coalition. So it was a great two-way benefit in our community. So jumping into objective 2, and this is a short one, let's talk about some techniques in engaging our community members in successful scan planning and implementation. I've touched on this just a little bit, but it's really important to plan your scan. So we don't just sit down at a coalition meeting and say, hey, let's go do an environmental scan. We really want to set clear goals. So we want to sit down, we want to be intentional, and we want to truly think about what we want the outcome of this scan to be. Because we don't want to waste a lot of time sending our volunteers out to hundreds of different businesses and then think, oh man, wouldn't it have been great if we had looked for fill in the blank? So we want to make sure that we are thorough in our planning and that we set our goals from the very beginning. We want to define what we want to assess. Are you looking at alcohol outlets? Are you looking at park safety? Are you looking at lighting or advertising? What is it that you need to understand? It's really good to tie this to a local condition. If we have a local condition that is specific, identifiable, and actionable, meaning we're telling the who, what, when, where, how about the behavior that's happening, it then really defines exactly what we need to know about that behavior or that condition. So as we're planning, we also want to know who needs to be involved in this activity. When we think about the alcohol scans, for example, the police had to be by state law involved. We also had to have a minor informant, and guess what? Their parent had to be involved as well, because they had to have parent permission. Our juvenile court judge also had to give permission. That's for tobacco. I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. We were working with 18, 19-year-olds, but we still had parent involvement there. And then we also created that data collection tool, which I mentioned. This can come in a couple different examples. The first is an observation checklist. I mentioned this before, where if you walk into a place, you might have a checklist. Do they have this? Yes. How many? Do they have this? Yes or no? If so, how many? That's an observation checklist. So that's one way. You could use an observation checklist on a Google form. You could use a form stack. You could use a Survey Monkey. There are lots of different ways that you could incorporate an observation checklist so that it would go directly into some sort of database. Survey forms are also a great way to utilize data collection tools. Survey forms for if you were gauging customers who were coming in and out of a business or in and out of a high school football game, maybe an interview form to gauge questions or gauge perceptions from key informants could also be different ways to create data collection tools for your environmental scans. It's really important to understand the geographic area to be observed for lots of different reasons. But one, we want to make sure that if our community serves 5 different municipalities within one county, we don't want to just look at one. We want to make sure that we have a segment of all of those 5 municipalities. So we need to understand the geographic area that we're looking at to make sure that we're comprehensive in nature and they're not singling out one particular area over the other. For example, understanding the geographic area can also help us be mindful of social drivers of health. So if there is a food desert in our community, for example, and there is just one convenience store there where everybody gets their staples, it would be really detrimental to that population if that store was forced to close for a period of time because they continuously failed their compliance checks. And so we don't want to single out those businesses. We do want all of our businesses to maintain compliance with laws, but we don't want to over police particular areas of our community that might lead to furthering social drivers of health. And so just understand and be sensitive to those issues as they exist in your community. The next thing you want to do is conduct your scan. So we want to make sure that we're prepared and that we do our field work appropriately. So we want to use data to select our areas to scan. If you are in a really large metropolitan area, you might not have the ability to scan your entire community. So we might just want to scan hotspots or places of concern that are high traffic areas, but we want to be respectful and culturally sensitive if we're doing that. We want to be very clear in our observations. And here's a couple tips. We want to look for signage. We want to observe behaviors. We want to see the physical conditions of the environment and how people are interacting with that environment. We want to take notes. We want to have a consistent method, as I've mentioned several times, this is so important, have that consistent method for how we document our findings. Having photos, having written notes, having digital tools that will automatically quantify our information so that we have all of the data that we need from this experience that we can document so that we can compare later after we implement our strategies to see if we've contributed to community level change. Kathy, yes, I'll make these slides available and I'll send them to the Prevention Action Alliance team so that they can get it to you. We want to also make sure that we're engaging the community, that we're gathering data through informal conversations, that we're using surveys or focus groups or whatever tools that are culturally appropriate to make sure that we're engaging the people in the community in the process. Not only as people who are providing information through the process, but also as people who are collecting information through that process. And then finally, as I mentioned, we want to respect the community. We want to make sure that we're certainly addressing privacy. We want to make sure that we are being ethical throughout this process and that we are sensitive both culturally, demographically, and economically when we are conducting our field work. So making sure that we think about any of the barriers that we might face when we're engaging our environmental scan. We also want to make sure that we're collaborating with our volunteers. A lot of times these environmental scans would truly not be something that a coalition staff would be able to tackle on their own. So we're really reliant on our community volunteers in these efforts. So we've got to be able to plan ahead so that we have those clear tools for our volunteers to use. These tools have to be easy to train them on, and they also have to be easy to use because everybody out there is going to have a different level of comfortability with technology. So we've got to be able to be adaptable and be prepared in advance to make sure that everybody can use it even with very little instruction. So we also want to make sure that we have very consistent data entry. It's going to be problematic if somebody misspells the name of a business or the name of a street, because if we go to search, we might not be able to find it. It's also important that everybody is consistent from Stephanie's data entry to Ashley's data entry to Fran's data entry. We all need to be trained to enter our data exactly the same, no matter who's entering the data, who's collecting the data, or where that's happening. And so some ways that you can go around to make sure that you're consistent is having electronic ways that your coalition members can document their data, and then having the information automatically quantified. So this would happen, for example, if you use a Google form and you send a link out to all of your coalition volunteers, they can just be out in the field, and if they have a cell phone, they can tap that link and they can enter their data directly electronically while they're in that business or in the community collecting that environmental scan data. This gives us the opportunity for the Google Sheet then, because your Google form automatically transfers over to a Google Sheet and it's automatically quantified for you. You automatically already have charts and graphs associated with those data outputs. And so it takes the math off of us and it's just a little bit easier. It's a little bit more consistent. So think about how you'll overcome some of these data entry barriers and collection obstacles when you're in your planning phase. So finally, let's jump into our third objective and talk about how we're going to utilize our data now. We've collected it, we've analyze it. Now, how are we going to utilize our data as we move forward to try to shape our advocacy efforts? First thing we have to do is interpret the information that we've collected through our scan. So we have to be able to organize our findings. If we have qualitative data, we've got to be able to categorize our issues. Whether we have quantitative data or qualitative data, we're going to be looking for trends. I want to be able to identify trends that are occurring, if there are geographic trends or if there are trends based on the type of place. Lots of different ways we can identify trends. The second is to compare data across time or locations. So is there a specific time of day that behaviors are happening in your community? Or is there a certain part of the community where this behavior is happening and it's not happening in another part of the community? This is important when we come forward to think about our strategies. Why? Because we're obviously time and financially limited on what we can do. So if we know exactly when a behavior is happening and exactly where a behavior is happening, we can enforce that behavior much more effectively, and we can create strategies to disincentivize that behavior during that time and at that specific location, rather than just saying in the entire community all the time. So it helps us to really pinpoint our resources in the exact area where they're going to be most efficient and effective. It also gives us an opportunity when we interpret our scan results to identify any patterns or gaps. So meaning, are there any hot spots? Are there specific areas where this is happening? What trends are we seeing? Are there deficiencies in policies? So this ties back to maybe our policy analysis. Are we having this behavior because we don't have a policy, or because the policy is not being enforced? Or is it an environmental factor that we've observed while we're out watching the behavior happen? We also want to use our data for action. And this is really where the rubber meets the road here. We've got to be able to compile and then share our findings. So it's one thing to go and do your environmental scan, but you've got to share it with your community in order for change to occur from this activity. So when we share our findings, we also have to develop a recommendation for change. So as you're collecting your data, also be thinking, how do we identify the change strategy that's going to occur because we have this information? And then we have to report it. So we know that when we report data in our communities, we have to tailor our message for different audiences. So our local government is probably going to need a different type of message than the public. Our youth who carried those 7 giant bins of cigarette butts into town hall can't carry those all across the community and show every person. But it was very effective for local media. But we were able to tell the public by a press release and a photograph of the students holding the bins in front of city council. We were able to use the media, including social media and television, to share information about that, and then to interview both city council so that the city council chairperson could talk about why she was influenced to change her mind when the youth brought the bins versus when they came the first time. We also were able to interview some of our youth to talk about why they wanted to do this in the first place. So sometimes we have to tailor those messages. We're saying the same thing, we're just saying it in a different way through a different avenue so that it reaches the right people. This is really important for our grassroots advocacy effort because we've got to meet people where they are. We also want to use visual tools. In addition to the bins that the youth carried in, we can also use maps, we can use charts, we can use graphs. Infographics are really, really effective when we're sharing data from environmental scans. Those visual tools help us to understand where and how our strategies are going to be effective. And I see some comments in the chat talking about using stories, telling stories. We have to tell our stories. We have to have a narrative that combines with our data. And I see James talking about photo voice, and I've almost mentioned photo voice a number of times in this session because photo voice is a really outstanding way for youth and even adults to participate in environmental scanning, because almost all of us have a camera right in our pocket, accessible to us almost all the time. And so just being able to use our cell phones to snap a picture, to share what we're seeing, the picture is worth 1,000 words, right? The picture can tell the story. And if we have a whole bunch of pictures that are telling that same story, it can be very compelling. But how we pull those together in a visual to share those is worth everything. That's really where the rubber meets the road in your community when you're telling that story with those pictures. When I'm always thinking about Simon Sinek when I talk about data. I've been a numbers person my whole life. Right over here on my bookshelf, though, is Simon Sinek's book, Leaders Eat Last. Leaders Eat Last is one of his books, and he talks about data in that book. And I think this is a really important takeaway for coalition professionals, because I've worked in the coalition world for 20 years now, and I've often talked about data, but I've left a lot on the table when I just go in and talk about statistics. Because Simon Sinek's argument is we dehumanize people when we convert people to numbers. And in our field, I think we are tremendously guilty of doing that for a long time. And so it's really important that when we're talking about data, we combine it with a narrative so that we don't dehumanize the issue. So I encourage you to, if you haven't, and Juliana, I see that you've got that book right on your desk as well. I think it's really helpful, at least that excerpt. Go and look it up and read that part. Because, to everyone's point in the chat, thanks for your ongoing discussion there. It's really important to combine those data with our narratives. So once we do, we have to be able to use those data to fill in the data gaps on our logic model. And so pull in the data, map those data to your logic model. It's unbelievable how many times I review a logic model and people never actually follow through with the data collection tools or methods that they say they're going to. So they'll map data when they first get a grant or first start their logic model, but then they never get to actually implement that data collection mechanism, whether it be a focus group or an environmental scan, but do it. And when you do it, map that back to your logic model, because when you do that, you're going to be able to articulate your impact on the change in your community so much better. You're going to be able to say how much your coalition contributed to short-term change, to intermediate change, to long-term change. And when you do that, when you map those data back to your logic model, especially those local conditions, it gives you the ability to identify the implementation strategies that are going to leverage change. Because we've got to think about dose. It depends on the level of the problem of that local condition as to how much effort we need to put into the strategies to change it. And so by having especially these environmental scan data tied to our local conditions on our logic models gives us a higher degree of ability to leverage change by implementing the right strategy at the right place at the right time. And then we can identify that big bang policy change that it's going to take to change that environmental condition. So what's the policy change? What do we need to do to make sure that we are changing people's behavior by changing policy, by creating barriers or consequences, or changing the physical design of the environment so that we're leading people to where the healthy choice is always the easiest choice. We're changing and shifting their behavior in our community norms that way. And then finally, we want to engage in advocacy. We have to mobilize our people. And so in order for us to mobilize the community, we have to use those data. We've got to tell that story. And when we tell that story, we can get that grassroots effort really up and growing so that we can have that whole community of people saying the same thing, saying we need this for change because our community deserves it and our community needs it. We can do this by hosting town hall meetings. We can hold public forums. We can give presentations to local councils, to, I like to call it our civic circuit, the Elks Lodge, the Rotary clubs, the Civitan organizations, all of those groups of all of the doers in our community, the worker bees in our communities. We can give presentations to them to engage them in our ray of hope and our movement as well. This helps us to generate that community level support that it's going to take to move us forward in engaging in the change, especially that policy change and the norms change that we need to initiate in our community when we're going to have this trickle down effect of changing behaviors. And so I'm going to kind of bring things to a close, we've got a few more minutes. I want to leave some room for discussion, just in case you have any questions. So after thinking about environmental scans, framing the different types of environmental scans we can use, the different ways that we can use them, best practices for planning and implementing our environmental scans, what questions are popping around in your head? And I encourage you to either turn to the chat box or feel free to also raise your hand, and I'd love to have some dialogue with you over that. I'm going to go ahead and take my slides down so I can see you. You all are super good at engaging in the chat box, and I really appreciate that. I've started looking online to see if there were kind of some standard environmental scan tools out there. I didn't really find anything to that end, and so my recommendation to you would be if you want to engage in an environmental scan in your community, I would do some crowdsourcing. I would look to some nearby coalitions or similar coalitions across the country that are doing something similar to what you're doing and see what they've done before. No need to reinvent the wheel, but there are many different formats in which we can check out or check in with our peers in the profession, and we're really good at sharing. I don't know if you've ever tried to share with other people before in the field of substance use prevention, but people are real good at sharing. So just ask, because most people are willing to just send you everything they have. Okay, I see some
Stephanie,
questions coming in. Yes.
have you looked at the one from Iowa? I'm trying to find it real quick, but it's a really good one, and I like the way that they have it worked out. But I've taken it, and obviously it's from early 2000s as well, so not digitized in any way.
Yeah.
I was going to try to find it and drop it
Yeah,
in, but
I'm
it's
not
a good
familiar
one
with
to
that
kind of
one.
start with.
If you find it, Jennifer, drop it in the chat for us if you don't mind. Thank you. Tisha asks, how hard was it initially to get youth buy-in for your coalition? And I'll say not hard at all, because Tisha, we expected there to be trouble generating our youth coalition. And so we did some planning on the front end, and we decided that we would start our youth coalition by letting it be kind of prestigiously by nomination only. So the mayor and the principals of each of the schools nominated students to be on the youth coalition. And so because it was a mayoral appointment in our town, it was actually kind of prestigious, and the students thought it was cool. So it was super easy at first. From there, after the first 3 years of doing it that way, we kind of shifted, and guidance counselors made recommendations. But then for probably 2 years, but then the subsequent 7 or 8 years since that helped us start our coalition, it's just been word of mouth. The students come and self select to be part of the coalition. And Laura has some examples. So if you want to email Laura, Laura has put an email address in the chat box. See, I said we're good at sharing. So thank you, Laura. If you want some tools, email Laura.
You're welcome. Merry Christmas to you, Steph.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Some other Jennifer found the Iowa file, it looks like, and there are some other shared resources in the chat. I see one last question. This will be our last question and answer for the day. What's the best way to acknowledge limitations in our ability to initiate change as a local health department? Leadership is often apprehensive of loud advocacy work. I hear you, especially in the health department setting. That seems to be a national norm. I would engage volunteers. I would find the local substance use advocacy group in your community, and I would let them take the credit for everything. I think that's what we do as being coalition leaders anyway, is we help organize and facilitate the movement, and then we let all of our coalition volunteers get the credit. And so I think especially when you're in a health department setting or a setting in which you really aren't supposed to even speak of policy change in some communities, then we just let our coalition members take it and run. We let it be truly grassroots so that we don't get in trouble, and then they can just take all the credit for it. So great question there. Hey, listen, thank you all so much for being here today. I'm going to turn things back over to Fran, and I really appreciate your attention and your interactivity today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. What a great presentation. Just so many valuable takeaways from this, and I appreciate everyone sending all of their information in the chat. For those of you seeking continuing education credits, please remember to complete the post-session evaluation, which Ashley will be sending out in the chat. You will need to complete that to receive any continuing education credits. We have an exciting lineup. We have 2 more sessions left today. We have an hour break. For the next session, we'll be beginning at 1. It is Understanding Stress and Suicide in Rural Ohio Communities with Bridget Britton. There's a separate link that Ashley has also sent into the chat for session 3. So if you haven't registered for session 3 yet and you would like to attend, please do so with that link. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Stephanie, for your wonderful presentation. And we hope to see you for the next session. Enjoy your break.